Today's topic, or this morning's topic, is going to be the existence and nature of God. The reason why I like to lecture on this, and I've done a lot of work in this area, is because many of you, or many students, will be facing in philosophy classes, whether you go to a secular or a Christian school, certain challenges to your faith. And what I want to do this morning is to provide to you some ways of thinking about what we mean by the existence and nature of God. Oftentimes, as Christians, I went to a secular school as an undergraduate, and one of the things that I had to finally face was that I could not live my Christian life waiting for the next issue of Journal of Philosophy to see whether I really had good reasons to believe in God. Well, what I mean by that is, your faith does not rest on the latest argument by the best philosopher that came out yesterday. If you live that way, you will be internally tormented. Okay? Your faith rests on what you know to be true by your commitment to Christ. The arguments, the reasons, are part of the puzzle. That is, they give you reinforcement as to why you believe. Those who aren't Christians, those who are atheists, realize that they don't live that way. They don't wait for the next issue of the Journal of Philosophy to see whether their belief is justified. In fact, one of the things we're going to see this morning is that atheism, or the belief that God does not exist, has a lot of problems, and that in fact theism, or the belief that God exists, does a lot better job of explaining most of what we know to be true in ordinary life. So without further ado, let's get into the existence and nature of God. The first thing I want to talk about is, what do we mean by God? What do we mean by God? First, when we talk about God, it's important to understand that the word God to different people means different things. You know, you meet some people, they say, yeah, I believe in God. And what they mean by God is that everybody is part of God. You know, it's like the Dr. Pepper commercial. I'm a God, you're a God. Wouldn't you like to be a God too? Remember that? Anyone remember the old Dr. Pepper commercial? It's as if that's the life that they were living. Everybody is part of God. That's not what the Christian view is. Certainly human beings are made in the image of God, but we're not the same as God or part of God. I mean, one of the things that C.S. Lewis has pointed out is that one of the great paradoxes of believing everyone is part of God is that most people don't realize it. I mean, if you were God, wouldn't you know it? You know, being omniscient and not knowing it is a real big problem, right? Right? So we have to understand what the Bible teaches about God and what Christian theologians have said about the nature of God, which we get from the Scriptures. First thing is that God is the creator and sustainer of all that exists. All else that exists, because obviously God himself exists, but he's not the creator of himself. He has always existed. He's a necessary being. One of the questions that often gets posed to Christians, and every time I go over this in my classes at least my classes at Whittier and at UNLV, there will always be a student who will say, well, who made God? And you ever hear that? You say, well, you know, the universe had to come from somewhere, so God made it, and then someone will say, who made God? Well, of course, the question is misplaced, because if God is the sort of being that is self-existent, asking who made God is like asking who the Bachelor is married to. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. But this is a typical response by people. God is the creator and sustainer of all else that exists. All else that exists. Numerous passages in the Scriptures show this, and I've listed some of them on the study sheet. Acts 17:25, Colossians 1:16, Romans 11:36. B, God is omnipotent. Omnipotent. God is all-powerful. All-powerful. I believe we talked a little bit about this at the forum outside. How many people were out there when Professor Bauman and I were doing the forum? I talked a little bit about what omnipotence means. Oftentimes, you'll have, especially if you're in a secular philosophy class, the professor will pose this question, in many cases, to the students to sort of blow their minds or to get them upset or to provoke them to think, or all three. It will be something like this. The students will be asked by the professor, do you think that God is all-powerful? And the students who believe in God, which will be virtually all of them, if they're freshmen, right? They'll raise their hands and they'll say, well, yeah, of course God is all-powerful. And the professor will say, well, what does that mean? And someone will respond, well, God can do anything. Professor will say, really, can God make a rock so big that he cannot lift? And some student will say, yes, of course, because he can do anything. And the professor will respond, but he can't lift the rock then. He can't do everything. And then some student who will want to retreat from that will say, oh, no, he can't make the rock. And they'll say, well, he can't do that now. So now you're stuck. There's an internal problem with omnipotence. Now, the problem with that objection, and the problem with the way the students responded to it, is that there's a misunderstanding of what the Bible teaches when it comes to omnipotence, or what Christian theologians have meant by omnipotence. Omnipotence does not mean God can do anything that you can string together in words. Because stringing together things in words may not be anything that is actually even possible. For example, if I were to say, can God make a married bachelor? Now, we know what married means. We know what bachelor means. But married and bachelor are contradictory terms, right? Now, can God make a married bachelor? No. That doesn't count against God because it's not even a thing that's possible. It's just two words you strung together. It's like saying, can God make a heebie-jeebie? What's that? Well, God should know. He knows everything, right? If it's not a thing that's even conceptually possible, God can't do it. Okay? So don't be beholden to a notion of what omnipotence means that is given to you by a professor who doesn't agree with your worldview. After all, we as Christians have the right to preserve our worldview and to defend it as we think it ought to be defended. We shouldn't permit other people who disagree with us to define what Christianity is. Okay? God's omnipotence means that he's all-powerful, but we have to understand what that means. So God cannot make square circles, married bachelors, or brothers who are only children. He cannot do that. Does that count against his power? No, because those aren't even things that make sense. Okay? There are other things that God cannot do. He cannot sin. He cannot lie. He cannot cease to exist. Does that count against his omnipotence? No, because those things count against perfection. And part of God's nature is that he's all perfect. Why would you want an all-perfect, all-powerful God to be able to sin anyways? Right? It doesn't make any sense that you should even desire it. In fact, St. Augustine once said on this point, he said, neither do we lessen God's power when we say he cannot die or be deceived. This is the kind of inability which, if removed, would make God less powerful than he is. It is precisely because he is omnipotent that for him some things are impossible. This is the irony of omnipotence. Because God is all-powerful, there's some things he can't do. Namely, be less than all-powerful. Okay. So God is all-powerful, omniscient. God is all-knowing. He knows past, present, and future. He knows past, present, and future. That's what omniscient means. We went over, there's a number of passages that deal with that. Psalm 139, 17 through 18, Isaiah 46, 10, and 41, verses 21 through 24. Omniscience, in fact, or knowing the future is considered, at least in the Old Testament, there are numerous passages that discuss how to test a prophet. And one of the tests of a prophet or one of the tests of a false god is whether that god can know the future or not. And so you have in the Old Testament a clear articulation of the claim that God, of the property that God knows the future, he knows the past, and he knows the present, he knows everything. Disembodied. God has by nature no body. There's no physical thing that God is attached to. Now, as Christians, we believe that God was incarnate in Christ Jesus. But it's not necessary that God become incarnate. In other words, if God had created a different universe where, let's say, people didn't sin, there would be no need for salvation, right? So even though we believe that Jesus is the God-man, it's not necessary that God become man. It's just that once he created this world with the individuals in it who would sin, salvation was necessary. Okay? But it's not necessarily part of God's nature that he have a body. In fact, when we say that God is everywhere, it's not that he's a thing that fits in space. Right? If God were everywhere, we would be no room for us, right? He'd be one big guy, right? But what we mean by God is everywhere is that he is aware of everything and that he sustains everything. And in that sense, he's everywhere. In fact, he's kind of everywhere and nowhere. Right? Since God cannot be reduced to a particular time and space, you can't say he's everywhere in the sense that he fills every space. In another sense, since he transcends time and space, he's nowhere. It's kind of mind-boggling, I know. I like this stuff. This is great. Okay. So God, there's no, in fact, in John 4:24, it says God is spirit. We should worship him in spirit and in truth. God is necessary and the only God. What does it mean to be necessary? It means that you cannot not exist. You cannot not exist if you're necessary. All of us in this room, the entire universe is contingent. That means we depend on something else for our existence. Which means that if something had been slightly different, we would not exist. None of us are necessary. I know that's pretty ego-deflating, but none of us are necessary. Metaphysically, we may be necessary to take out the garbage, but we're not necessary metaphysically. That is, the universe would have gone on just as well without us. Okay. And that's part of understanding our role as creatures. Okay. We are not necessary. Now, that doesn't mean God doesn't love us. Obviously, he does. But it means that it is possible that none of us could have come into existence. If God had chosen to create something differently, or if certain situations had been different, some of us would have never come into existence. Okay? But God is necessary. He cannot not exist. He cannot not exist. Finally, God is a rational agent. God is a rational agent. That means that he's a person. He's not a human being, although he became a human being in Christ Jesus. He's a person. A person is an entity that is a rational agent, able to make decisions and interact with other persons. Angels are persons, but they're not human beings. And if the Star Trek universe were correct, Klingons would be persons that are not human beings. Right? So you could be a person without being a human being. Right? God is a person that is not a human being. He's a rational agent. He's not an it. He's not a force. Now, we know then how God is to be described, or we understand what the Bible teaches about God. What does it mean to believe in the existence of God? It means that we believe that God is a being that actually exists apart from us. God's existence is not dependent on us. Our belief does not make God real. To some people, they think that's what religion or theology is. That is to say, God is something we make up. In fact, there was a philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach, who had this view that God was a projection of our minds because we desired for God to exist. He doesn't really exist, but he's a projection of our minds. Now, of course, that's not what we mean when we say that God exists. Okay? The problem with Feuerbach's argument is that he assumes that because we desire something, therefore it doesn't exist. That's a flawed argument. It would be like saying that if I desired a milkshake to exist, it couldn't exist. And of course, it doesn't make any sense. I desire milkshakes all the time, and I understand they're everywhere. So just because I desire something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay? But what we mean is that God is independent of our minds. He objectively exists. Can he be observed with our senses? Well, only very few people have ever actually observed God, and those individuals have either died or God has only shown himself in the form of an incarnation or other manifestations. But can we actually observe God in his nature and his essence? No. We cannot observe God in his fullness. Why? Because we are finite individuals. We're finite beings. But we mean that God exists, we mean that he's independent of us, that he objectively exists. Now, how would we defend the existence of God to somebody who let's say, doesn't believe in the Christian God or God at all, and they say, I want to have a reason to believe that God exists? Well, there's all sorts of arguments that philosophers have put forth to defend the existence of God. I'm going to go over two that I find to be quite compelling arguments. Now, keep in mind that when I say that you have to have that you can present an argument to those who don't believe, I'm not saying that in order for you to believe that you have to have an argument. There are numerous people on this planet who I think are perfectly rational in believing in God who are not philosophers, namely my grandmother. My grandmother, I think, is perfectly rational in believing in the existence of God, but she probably doesn't know the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, or any of these other arguments. I think that she's rational because she has seen in her own life the work of God in different things. She's prayed, things have happened. She's fellowshiped with God. And if an atheist comes along like Madalyn Murray O'Hair or somebody like that and says, you're not rational in believing in God, my grandmother, if she's really clever, could say, you're nothing but an intellectual imperialist. You're trying to force what you think are the criteria of rationality on me to make me feel bad that I believe in the existence of God. But I feel that I'm perfectly rational in believing in God's existence. Every time I look up into the starry heavens, I see his handiwork. When I pray, I sense his presence. When I do something bad, I feel wicked. I think his eyes are looking upon me. So, Ms. O'Hair, if you don't think it's rational, so be it, but I think it is. Okay? Now, if Madalyn Murray O'Hair says, well, but give me a reason to believe in God, now that's what we're talking about here, giving somebody else a reason why we ought to believe in God, that individual ought to believe in God, or why that person would be more rational in believing in God than not. Okay? Now, the first argument I want to go over is really not a knock-down, drag-out proof for God's existence. What it is, it's a comparison of the theistic worldview or the worldview that says that God exists versus the atheistic worldview. And this argument is called the transcendental argument for God's existence. What's a transcendental argument? A transcendental argument is one in which one infers that something is necessary in order for something else to be true. Let me give you one real simple example. If I make the claim that I can know things, a transcendental argument would say that, therefore, I must have a mind. In other words, for me to know something, I have to have a mind. I'm not saying I have evidence for a mind or, look, I did research to prove a mind. What I'm saying is that once I acknowledge that something is real, that knowledge is possible, a mind is a necessary thing. Okay? That's what a transcendental argument is. It's a way of finding out what's true based on what we already know to be true. Okay? Or looking at what we know to be true and inferring, in some sense, that something else must be true. Okay? That's a transcendental argument. Now, atheism says, or naturalism says, that everything in the world is ultimately reducible to the physical. That is to say, everything that exists can be quantified in some way. You don't have a soul. Okay? You have a brain. And that's all you are, is your brain and your body. Your thoughts are not immaterial. They're material in some way. When you have the thought, today is Saturday, there's some electrical impulse in your brain that corresponds to today is Saturday. Okay? It's a physicalist view of the universe. Physicalism would exclude many things besides the soul or the mind. What else would it exclude? Morality. Because morality is non-physical. If I say, for example, it is wrong to torture babies for fun, I can't prove that empirically, but I can know that it's real, although it's not physical. Okay? The atheist has to deny that that claim is in any sense real. Okay? Because his worldview denies that non-physical things can really exist. Okay? Another part of the atheist worldview is that human beings are the result of blind chance and evolution. right? Blind chance and evolution. Human beings have arrived at the end of a long time of evolving, beginning with space plus time plus energy plus chance. And then out from the end of the process is us. Okay? And everything in the world that has come from that process is physical. Now, the Christian worldview is that there is a physical world, but God created it with a certain order or purpose to it. But there are also non-physical things that exist, like morality, minds and souls, angels, numbers. You ever think about that? Do numbers exist? They're not physical. Think about that. They're not physical, right? Anyone here a math major? Anyone a math major? If numbers are not real, you are learning nothing. Numbers have to be real, but they're not physical. Now, in fact, numbers are so real that if the architect or the engineer who built this home, or this hotel, was only a few inches off here and there, the whole thing would collapse. Right? Numbers are not only real, they matter. Right? But the atheist worldview cannot even account for something as simple as numbers. Because those are non-physical things that never change. What's something about the physical world that differs from the non-physical world? Physical things change all the time. In fact, even though it may appear that none of us are changing as we sit here, we're changing. Our cells are being replaced. Things are happening all the time. The non-physical world, things don't change. Logic doesn't change. The law of non-contradiction has always been true. And yet, even logic itself cannot be accounted for in the atheist worldview. How can I'll give you an example of how this works. A couple of years ago, I was invited to debate a gentleman who is the head of the Nevada Humanist Association. I was invited to debate him at the local Unitarian church. And one of the ways that I knew that he knew different arguments for God's existence, so I wanted to approach this in a slightly different way. So what I did is I began with this transcendental argument for God's existence. And I said that my opponent believes that my view of God and the universe is illogical or irrational. Unfortunately, his view of the universe can't even explain logic. And so I said, before we even talk about whether God exists, I would like Mr. Lippman to explain what logic is and where did it come from. He said, logic is a technique that we use. And I said, but is it real? Is it part of the furniture of the universe? Is it real? Is it as real as physical things? But it's just not physical. He said, well, no, it's something that we make up. I said, okay, I make up God exists. I win. Now, if you could be justified in your starting point by saying that your view is not real, well, certainly I can win easily too that way. He said, well, no, it is. Then he backtracked. No, what I mean is that it is real, but it's not like a physical thing. I said, well, I agree with you. It's not physical, but it's real. But I said, Mel, look at it this way. Logic is non-physical, it's real, applies everywhere, and it doesn't change. You say that everything in the universe comes from the physical world, and it's always changing. Logic does not fit in your universe. You have no place for it. I said, there are other things you don't have a place for. You can't explain morality, human souls, human minds, or numbers, or virtue. There's nothing in fact, all the things that make life worth living, you can't explain. He had never heard an argument like this before. And one of the reasons is that he has probably debated not many Christian philosophers. I think he had debated one Baptist minister who had like tried to exorcise a demon from him or something, so his impression of Christians debating was not very good. Okay, it was not very good. And he's also used to being around people who always agreed with him. That is to say, he had just taken for granted all this stuff that exists in the world and embraced atheism, but never thought in his mind how atheism makes sense of all these other things. In other words, he had never been challenged to explain how atheism can explain these things that we just take for granted in everyday life. Okay? And I went on to tell him, I said, you're even in a worse position than that, Mel. Look, you're saying that everything in this universe has evolved based on one fundamental principle of Darwinian evolution, that is survival of the fittest. Okay? Your mind is the result of blind chance. How can you trust your own mind? If you knew that a computer that you had bought had software downloaded at random, would you buy that computer? No. Okay. You wouldn't buy it. Why? Because you knew it's not going to give you good information or true information. Well, your mind, according to the evolutionary naturalistic worldview, is not only just physical, it's the result of chance and survival of the fittest. In fact, there's no assurance that your mind actually tells you about the truth. I mean, it may be that, that we've survived due to evolution, but maybe the survival of the fittest is the result of us not knowing the truth about the world. Maybe our minds lie to us, and that helps us survive better. I threw this out. I said, how do you know that you know anything? So in an atheistic worldview, you have no assurance of even knowledge itself. Now, as a Christian, I believe that we were created in the image of God, that there are certain non-physical things in the universe, including numbers and minds and souls and things like that. And logic really exists, and logic is in the mind of God, and being being made in the image of God, God has imparted to us certain characteristics by which we can know things that are non-physical. And I said, now you may not accept my view, but look, theism makes a lot more sense of all these things than your view. And then he went on, he said, but you have the problem with the problem of evil. If God is good, why is there evil? And I said, you can't even tell me what good is. How can you start blaming God for allowing evil? He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, earlier in the morning, we had debated Sunday morning, he said that morality was relative, that there's no objective moral standards of any kind. I said, if there's no objective moral standards, how can you blame God for allowing evil? Because you don't even believe such a thing as good. I said, so even the problem that you find the strongest against theism, you have to borrow from my worldview in order to attack me. Evil only makes sense if there's such a thing as an objective good. Now, if there's such a thing as an objective good, as Christians, we believe it resides in the person of God. So what I told Mr. Lippman was, in order for you to attack my worldview, you have to borrow from it. I said, thank you very much for giving me yet another argument for believing that God exists. See, we have to be very confident in what we believe. I think one of the problems in our culture today is as Christians, we're always put on the defensive to have to defend our view as if the burden was always on us. And what I have been trying to do this morning is to show you that there are numerous things, the most important things in the world, that the atheistic worldview cannot even come close to explaining in any way. Whereas the Christian worldview does a pretty nice job of explaining those things. It's not a knockdown, drag-out proof for God's existence, but it's a comparison of worldviews to show which one makes the most sense of what we know to be true. Now let me move on to another argument. This is a little bit more traditional of an argument for God's existence. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. And we've only got about 12 minutes left, so I will go over this as quickly as I can, as clearly as I can, but I will warn you that it involves some pretty high-level things. The Kalam cosmological argument comes from, the word Kalam refers to Arabic philosophy. It was actually an argument developed by Arabic philosophers in the Middle Ages, which has been picked up recently by a number of Christian philosophers. If you look on the study sheet, I have a chart there. You've got to look at the Kalam argument as a series of dilemmas. At the very top, I have the universe. Either the universe has a beginning or no beginning. Those are only two options. It can't be, it's either one or the other, right? Either the universe began to exist or it's always existed. If the universe has a beginning, it either has a cause or no cause, right? That's the only two options. Either it was caused by something or it wasn't. And finally, the cause is either personal or impersonal. That is to say, the cause was either a rational agent or just some force, right? If we can show that each half of the dilemma that leads to theism is more reasonable than the other half, then we have a pretty good argument to demonstrate or to show that belief in God is something that the atheist ought to at least consider. Okay? Now let's look at the first. Obviously, we know the universe exists. I mean, that's, if you run into someone who doesn't believe the universe exists, kick them. And then he say, there's part of the universe, just kicked you. There's nothing more dangerous than a student who takes one philosophy class. Those are the worst. They hang out at the dorms. They go, hey, prove I exist, man, and stuff like that. Okay. That's when you wish you had Clint Eastwood right there, right? Go ahead, make my day. Right? We know the universe exists. Does it have a beginning or no beginning? Well, there's lots of reasons why we ought to believe the universe had a beginning. There are numerous things in science that tell us that the universe had a beginning. I don't list these on the study sheet, but let me briefly mention one, the Big Bang theory of the beginning of the universe. That theory says that at a point of infinite density, there was an explosion from which the entire universe evolved. Do you know what infinite density is? Nothing. Something came from nothing is what is being said in the Big Bang theory. Now, I don't know about you, but the first thought that I ever had when I first heard that in college was, well, what came before the universe? Or what made it? Of course, the professor said, oh, we don't care about that. That's not science. But I think it shows that the universe had a beginning. I mean, it shows that it began at some point in time. Now, there are other reasons why we ought to believe that the universe had a beginning. Another scientific reason is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe is moving towards heat death. What does heat death mean? That everything is going to be the same temperature everywhere. Did you ever put an ice cube down on a table and it melts? You know what's going on? The ice cube is moving closer to the temperature of the room. Right? Imagine that the entire universe that's happening. It is happening. Everything is spreading out, expanding, and moving towards the same temperature. It's happening at a very slow rate, obviously, because we're here. Right? But if you think about it, if the universe had always existed, it should have happened already. You have enough time for it to happen. How much more time than an infinite time could you want? If you walked in a room and saw a clock ticking or heard a clock ticking, wouldn't that prove that the clock was wound up at the beginning? If you walked into if the clock had been ticking for all eternity, it couldn't be ticking for all eternity. That's the problem. It would have already wound down. In fact, no matter how early you came into the room, it would not be ticking. That's kind of mind-boggling. Okay, let me give you a philosophical argument of why the universe has a beginning. And I have it under B, number 1. The series of events in time is a collection formed by adding one member after another. A collection formed by adding one member after another cannot be actually infinite. Therefore, the series of events in time cannot be actually infinite. What is an actual infinite? An actual infinite is an unlimited set, like the set of all natural numbers, 1 through infinity. Now, if I began counting from 1, I could never count every single number in the infinite set, even if I lived forever. If the universe had no beginning, no matter how far back in time you'd go, if you were in a time machine, you wouldn't even get closer to the beginning. Kind of mind-boggling, I know. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I want everybody in the first row here to stand up. I want everyone to stand up. Okay, stand up, and as you sit down, just say the number 1, 2, or whatever, okay?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, we traversed a series of 6 things, right? We got there. Now, let's say we added another row onto that. 6, we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13, okay? We would be able to finish it, right? What if this room had an infinite number of rows? Would we ever be able to get to the last student? No. If the past were infinite, and let's say this gentleman here was the present, we would never get to him if we started from the infinite past counting forward. Okay? We would never get to him. Why? Because you cannot traverse an infinite. If I were to get into my car now and drive to Denver, and Denver is what, 70 miles away, roughly? I would get there, right? 70 miles. But what if I went on 25 and I saw the sign for an infinite? It says Denver with infinite. Now, I better have a full tank of gas, right? The funny thing is, no matter how much I drive, the sign will always say Denver Infinite. I'm never going to get closer to Denver. It's like running on a treadmill and trying to get to Denver. You're never going to get there. Now, if the past is infinite, we wouldn't be here today. We could never have reached the present moment. The past must have had a beginning. Let's say you wanted to borrow your neighbor's lawnmower. I'll use another analogy. Okay? And your neighbor says, I can't lend it to you. I borrowed it from John. John, why don't you go talk to him? You go to John, and John says, I actually borrowed it from so-and-so. And it turns out if you never reach, if there's an infinite number of people that borrowed it, you're never going to get the lawnmower. Right? Well, think about the present as getting the lawnmower. You're never going to get to today if there are an infinite number of moments in the past. Okay? If that's the case, then the universe had a beginning. And since we know that something cannot come from nothing, the universe must have had a cause. And if the universe had a cause, the question then is it personal or not personal? Well, if it were not personal, then the universe should have always existed. Because an impersonal cause, if present, automatically makes the effect come into existence, right? But only if you have an agent can something actually begin at a moment. Imagine if a fire, let's say that a cause of a match lighting, what's a cause of a match, of someone striking a match? You've got the match, oxygen, the person, and so forth. The distinguishing factor is the striking of the match by an agent. The universe began to exist. The agent had to be eternal, but timeless, because if it were in time, the same problem would arise as in infinite past, right? So the cause of the universe has to be a timeless agent that brought the universe into existence, which sounds a lot like God. Okay. All right, we have about 2 minutes left. Any questions? Every time I say that after this lecture, I think of that one commercial, this is your brain on drugs. It's like, any questions? This is your brain on philosophy. Any questions? Right? Yeah.
This is more like a statement.
Sure.
You know, like you're saying, God is outside of time, and they keep saying, well, we haven't found God yet. Well, they're never going to find God because God is outside of space-time.
That's right. It's like that Johnny Lee song, they're looking for love in all the wrong places, right? You know, they're looking for God in all the wrong places. You know, any other questions at all? Oh, come on, there's got to be a question. Yes, go, Sarah.
I kind of understand the difference between these two, but I was wondering how you would explain it to someone. That the fact with God being omnipotent and that he can't make a married bachelor because that doesn't exist. How would you explain to someone the virgin birth and how that's different from...
That's a good question. How would you distinguish a virgin birth from, say, a married bachelor? Well, there's difference between physically impossible and logically impossible. Logically impossible are things that are conceptually don't make sense, like married bachelor or let's say, a person that is both dead and alive. Okay, if we understand those words in the same meaning, or a square circle. Those are conceptually impossible. Whereas a virgin birth is not conceptually impossible. Isn't that word concept is conception? Is that, what?
Like you can imagine?
You can imagine it to be true. I mean, you can imagine an all-powerful being making it possible for a virgin to conceive a child. Just like a Superman. Superman is physically impossible, but not logically impossible. I mean, we can imagine somebody having the power to fly. I mean, there's nothing, it's physically impossible knowing what we know about physics, but we can easily imagine, let's say, a race of people from another world who have defeated the physics that we know today. I mean, we do that with air. Imagine a person 19th century, let's say 1820, and you say, I imagine, 10,000-pound things flying through the air, or say, that's impossible. It was physically impossible in 1820. It's physically possible today. So the difference between conceptual impossibility and physical impossibility. All right, any other questions before we call it a morning? This is the last time I'm speaking during this session. Thanks a lot, and I appreciate you guys taking the 2 weeks here to spend at Summit. It's worthwhile, and it's nice to have met some of you and being able to lecture to all of you. Thank you. Thank you.